take you live now to the Durban ICC. Intellectual property remaining one of the issues that the creative industry continues to grapple with. My co-anchor Ayanda Nyathi joins us now live from the ICC in Durban to shed light on this issue. Ayanda, day 5 of the Intra-African Trade Fair.
Absolutely, Michelle, and the focus today is on ways through which the experience of those in the creative industry can be bettered, and matters around intellectual property rights are certainly central, or hoping to be central, throughout the course of the day. Often we hear of artists in some respects who've had really great careers, at the end of those careers not having much to show for it. This, in some respects, links to whether or not they're able to own what they create. And so let's break it down for you, get you a sense of what else we need to think about, and bring in our guest. Her name is Lenjo. She is an intellectual property and entertainment lawyer, joining us here on our makeshift setup. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us, Liz. Really do appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
I don't want to take it for granted that people know what intellectual property even is. So perhaps let's begin there. When we speak about IP, what are we referencing and why does that matter?
So we're talking about creations of the mind, right? And intellectual property law is the area of law that helps you protect now these creations of the mind. So which means transforming these ideas into assets. That's what IP is generally alluded to. So basically, we want to understand what is this idea that you have, how can we express it and then protect it. So I'm sure we've heard about patents, and most of the time people will say, oh, I want to patent my idea. No, patent is actually a form of protection under IP, which is the highest form of protection. And why it's the highest form of protection, it's because it's something that's never been done before in the whole world, right? So it's new, novel, and industrially applicable. So you have to be the first person to have ever done it in the world for you to get a patent. So you can imagine, if in the creative industry, we might not be talking about that. We'll be now talking about the other IP regimes. We're talking about copyright, for example. Copyright protects now the expression of the ideas themselves. We're talking about literary works. We're talking about artistic works, photography, architecture, poetry, sculptures. That's the kind of realm we're talking about. In some countries, software. Some countries will patent software. Some countries will copyright software. That's a whole interesting discussion. But of course, you want to copyright software because then it's easily accessible, and then you can sort of re-innovate around it. Because, like I said, copyright is about the expression of ideas. And again, I'll use a very simple example. When you look at soap operas, for example, you'll find a storyline that's always similar. Mother-in-law hits the daughter-in-law and something like that. Yeah. But it's about how it's expressed. That's what sets the different productions apart. So you cannot have monopoly of an idea. We all went to school. We're all exposed to the same stuff. So it's about what we do with it, right? So copyright is about that, the expression of ideas, and it lasts for the lifetime of the author, and then maybe 50 to 70 years after death, so depending on the jurisdiction that you're in. So again, now, especially for copyright, we are now into a regime where we have to register your copyright because it happens automatically once you've expressed it. It's moved from the mind to either that painting or that drawing or that song you sang. But now registration becomes very important because you're basically asserting your rights. You're basically saying, hey, this is my property, right?
Let me ask you this, Liz. Help us connect the dots to how that affects, I guess, the kind of even money that artists are able to make, right? We've heard quite often that there are instances where, because people duplicate some of the work, for instance, that comes from the creative industry, they're not able to make as much money from that. Something like IPs, how does that, in some respects, protect those artists from that kind of abuse?
So that conversation about registration, right? In some countries, it's not a must. In some countries, it is a must. But where you have that opportunity to register, do it. Because what happens is you get a certificate. Just like how you buy a piece of land, you get a title deed. It's the same thing now with copyright, for example, that you're able to declare that I'm so-and-so and I sang this song. So that now when there's also a dispute, you have an initial proof that this is my song. So now it's up to you to prove otherwise, right? And then with that documentation, now I'm able to properly trade and commercialize, get into distribution deals, and also actively sue in cases where there's infringement, right? Because now everyone knows that it's my property, it's my work.
Yeah. Interestingly, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is really what underpins what we're doing here at the Inter-African Trade Fair, is trying to harmonize laws across different countries on the continent so that trade can be enhanced and there can be an economic spillover insofar as the benefits are concerned. When it comes to IP, how harmonized are the laws across the African countries? Because we do know that a lot of the regulations with intellectual property are actually quite region-specific.
It's actually, the principles are the same, be it copyright, be it trademark, protection of brands, be it industrial designs, protecting the aesthetics, be it patent. The principles are all the same, not only in Africa but also internationally. We have the same principles. What will vary is maybe the term of protection in terms of years, but like patents, it's specific, it's 20 years. Copyright is the one that's a little fluid, might be 50 to 70 years after death. In some countries, 100 years after death. Industrial designs, it's about after 15 years. The rights sort of expire, fall into the public domain. Trademarks are renewed every 10 years in all countries across the world. Right. So you find the principles are the same. I think the greatest challenge becomes now the issue of access, because what happens is in the different countries, I will also be helping you as your legal counsel to register. You have to pay statutory fees. So perhaps maybe a conversation we need to have is the affordability, right. Because at the end of the day, it becomes very expensive for especially African creatives and African entrepreneurs. Perhaps figure out a legal structure where we put together a pool of lawyers who are able to find ways to also earn, but at the same time are still making it affordable. Right. That's where the challenge lies.
Absolutely. Another one of the interesting discussions that are taking place is whether or not IP sometimes create barriers that exclude people from accessing information. You know, there are in some instances matters to do with literature, for instance, where certain institutions are not able to duplicate certain literature because of IPs, and that has a disadvantage on the people who would otherwise be able to benefit from it, being able to access that information. Are we getting any better at, I guess, working our way through that complexity?
I think it's just the awareness, because with intellectual property we have exceptions and limitations where you can basically have access in so long as perhaps you're going to educate masses, you're going to use it for personal use, you're going to use it as a news piece, for example. Those are exceptions where you don't need the permission of the author or the writer. So it's just about understanding that and then being able now to effectively navigate and grant access to this information. And sometimes it might mean either going directly to the source if you have like an expert or a writer. I mean, there's always creative ways. I think it's just about people being aware and being more fierce about trying to pursue this knowledge.
Lenjo, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate your breaking it down for us. It's not the kind of conversation I imagine artists want to be having, but it's one I hope that many will be having, especially when you consider what's at stake. Liz, once again, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate it. Liz Lenjo is an IP and entertainment lawyer, speaking to us there about intellectual property law, especially when it comes to creative and cultural industries. And that's going to be a big focus on day 5 of the fair.